What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS, here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown.
And you're tuned into season 2, episode 6 of The Last Up Intellectual. All right, y'all. So this week's Shoot the Shit is a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of a reflection on what's been happening in the world. But before we get to this week's Shoot the Shit, we want to give a shout out to our 2 new patrons, Darren Mack and Cipriano Belser. But thank you all, as always, for supporting, for watching, for tuning in, and for giving us your coins, because we know what that struggle is. Okay, so. Now, this has been a week because, we had the verdict of the Rittenhouse trial come out. And even though I think there's a lot of things that people have said and want to say about it, I think we decided this week to kind of take a different approach to responding to what's happening with the Rittenhouse trial. And what has inspired this is this particular tweet that we came across. So it says, Rittenhouse. As many have noted, there is a long history of white people targeting those white people who side with Black activism and challenge white supremacy, and a lack of state intervention when they do so. So this thread takes us through a number of different instances where different white people have, I think we had John Brown just there. There was some example from the civil rights movement. But what I wanted to read here, that last one. And then she said, Janine says, and the list could go on. Just as in Kenosha, there is a long history of the white people who dared step outside and challenge white supremacy, becoming targets of violence and lack of state protection alongside the Black activists and community members they were organizing with. So the reason why I think this particular thread on the conversation is important, one is because I think, I think we're over the kind of immediate sort of knee-jerk outrage over his lack of conviction, because I don't know about university, but I would venture to say none of us really expected anything different, right? And so this is less about what his innocence or guilt in the courts determining that, but more about the message that it sends. And so maybe I was thinking maybe CBS, you could talk to what the message that letting Rittenhouse go free kind of sends to the public at writ large.
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, what's very interesting to me about this is there was the whole outside agitator discourse. That's a old and tired, played the fuck out discourse about, the Blacks being riled up from some entity from without, whether it's like Northern Negroes, carpetbaggers, communists, whomever, right? Germans, Bolsheviks, whomever. But it's like he was the very outside agitator that everybody was warning about. He literally came from elsewhere to come and, and pop shit. And yet and still he gets off, scot-free through this discourse of self-defense, which, as we know, is very, very weighted in the favor of white folks, period, right? And so it was just as an aside, it was just very strange for me to see like Black folks, and it was a lot of the sort of FBA, ADOS types defending his right to self-defense and all this as if this outcome in any way pertains to them or in any way applies to them. It's a weird cognitive dissonance, because we know that the Second Amendment or self-defense never applies to Black people in the same way that it applies to white folks. So that's just goofy in my perspective. But the other thing to say about it is basically, this idea that nigger lovers, white folks who are nigger lovers, are just as guilty as Black folks because they are race traitors, right? And they are, they can be construed as race mixers, all of these other sorts of discourses that make them dangerous because of their proximity to Blackness and their recognition of a particular type of like Black humanity or Black equality, Black belonging, etc. But I think that the other thing we need to be very, very careful of is still not recentering white people in this way. We can acknowledge how they are victimized by the very same technologies and techniques of the state because of their proximity to Blackness, but we still don't want to recenter the discourse to only focus on white folks because they're victimized as well. So I think that we need to be able to like hold both of those things together.
It's funny, we did a on the Black Myths podcast, shameless plug, I guess. We're in the midst of doing a series. The myth is racial violence equals hate. And this idea that you can explain any type of violence, whether it be lynchings or anything of that nature. It can be reduced down to they're just doing it because they hate us, and that disconnects it from the state, that disconnects it from capital, that disconnects it from the entire way that the system works, right? And it just gets bogged down to white people are just mean to us, and then that always opens up the door for this kind of like Reformation project or white rehabilitation. This is how you end up with the BS of critical race theory. Like I was listening to a show, actually, she's going to be on the show next week. I was listening to Brianna Gray Joy's show, and she had a guest on there who was talking about how we need to re-educate white folks, which I don't completely disagree with in some cases, but I do think that there's something to be said about just emphasizing this idea of it being kind of this psychological thing or just this cultural thing about white folks, and it doesn't really deal with the sense of capital. So in the episode, first one, it's based on the author's Rasul Mawat and his book Geographies of Threat and the Production of Violence, the State and the City Between Us, and he talks about how the state actually constructs a lot of this stuff more so spatially because he's dealing with it from a geographical standpoint. But in the second episode, we go over what he calls the racial violence continuum. He has 11 different identities of like racial violence, one from like basically the least extreme to the most extreme, but the most alarming, as he says. So it's like it goes race massacres and riots is one, 2 is racial coups, 3 is mass lynchings, 4 is individualized lynchings, 5 is gun violence, 6 is state executions, 7 is police killings, 8 is racialized recreational murder, 9 is racial hunting, 10 is ethnic cleansing, and then 11 is race war. So it's a long list.
PBS brain. There's no way I could have remembered 10 points.
He was reading that shit. That was off the top of the beanie. He was not spitting off the top of the beanie, my dude.
Okay, on top of the beanie. But when you gotta edit shit for 2 hours, you memorize shit on accident. But the one, I mean, it's a lot to go over. So it actually airs. It would have aired 2 days prior to this episode on airing, so it airs on a Wednesday. This episode airs on a Friday. But the one I would signal the Kyle Rittenhouse is racial hunting, and he talks about how a lot of times what we understand as lynchings. He's arguing he's studied lynchings for like 20 years, and he's arguing that there's something even worse than lynchings. When lynchings was to send a certain pedagogical message of like social control, and you lynch niggas for the goal of don't do anything, and we hang you from a tree to send that example. But he's like, when you have people who are hunting, whether we're talking about Rittenhouse or Ahmaud Arbery, it's like that's just random.
Sport.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you have the recreational part where it's just like we're just kind of out here and maybe we just shoot black people. Hunting is more intentional, right? So even when this sense of Rittenhouse, even though he kills white people, he's down there for a very particular purpose. He's talking about, I'm here as an EMT or whatever. That's BS. But he's down there with a gun for a particular purpose. Like he drives across straight lines. Like this is hunting. And then when the white folks get killed, like CBS, like you both said, they're racialized as black in the moment because they're at this protest, they're at this riot, and they are against property. And that is always going to deem you lower just by that basis. So when you go to Ahmaud Arbery, I know we haven't gotten to that all the way yet, but it's the same thing. Like they're hunting. They're not really trying to get found out in the same way that we understand lynching, where we're purposely displaying the body. Mm-hmm. These idiots just tape themselves anyway, probably to share amongst their group. So when we're talking about the state, it's often they enable these vigilantes. And I think that's the real concern. I think that's fair for people to have is that this is just a further enabling of the vigilantes. Like I think we talked about in a previous episode, where sometimes the state will come down on these folks, not because they are against that type of violence, but maybe because that messes with something that they're trying to do. Like we talked about on an episode where there's studies that have been done where in certain cities where production was high, lynchings tended to be lower because the state would intervene because it was actually fucking with the production of money, right? Like you can't have all these lynchings because you're messing with labor in more rural areas.
Fucking with my property. I need to go do work.
Exactly. But if you're trying to enable vigilantes, which is a long history of that, that's essentially what the Second Amendment is enabling vigilantes to clear land. So because you don't have the army yourself to do it, so you just enable a bunch of settlers to do it, right? So like I think that's the larger precedent to be worried about here, not just whether we need to reform white men or I'm just really not interested in that.
Just one point of clarification. So the white folks that are murdered are not racialized as Black. They're racialized as failed whites. They're racialized as race traitors and nigger lovers. And so I make that distinction because
that's a good distinction.
It's a genre of sort of dangerous whiteness, right? As we know, whiteness is fungible. It expands and contracts in ways that are very much related to capital and the state and accumulation. But I just think that that's an important distinction because Black people can't be nigger lovers because they're niggers, right? And so so there's just a particular category of like repugnant and dangerous whites that fall into that category.
Yeah, hence white trash. Yeah, I'll take that correction. Yeah, hence like white trash, right? Like you're a failure at whiteness, essentially. Like that's a similar. Now it's not the same as a race traitor because you're not acting against anybody, but there's still a certain hierarchy of whiteness. I agree. Yeah.
Layla?
For that convo. I mean, no, I don't really know what I have to add to that conversation, to be honest. I think it was. I didn't really expect Tupac to go down the history like that. So I think you got it. You said it.
Yeah. Period. Okay. Well, so I guess the question then is like, how might this trial have a bearing on the Ahmaud Arbery decision? I mean, my personal perspective is that they're two different. They're kind of sort of linked, but different. I guess I'll say, let me start over. So if we think about the Rittenhouse case in relationship to the Ahmaud Arbery case, I think it's an interesting triangulation that I don't exactly know what the outcome will be because there's Chauvin, then there's Rittenhouse, and then there's this case that seems to be sort of somewhere in between because they weren't offered, the white folks that murdered Ahmaud Arbery weren't white folks, they were civilians, but at the same time, and they were
vigilantes. It's Trayvon Martin.
It'll be interesting to see how the self-defense argument holds up. I just don't know if it seems like more shaky ground than the Rittenhouse. Now, at the same time, I think the way that they pick the jury is similar to the ways that Rittenhouse was given all of these privileges and permission during his trial. And so I think it could go either way. What do y'all think?
No, I mean, when I say that it's Trayvon Martin, like that was the same way that George Zimmerman was essentially able to use a self-defense argument, in spite of the fact that he chased Trayvon Martin down. So in terms of what way do I think it'll go, I think we have a parallel precedent for that one. I don't know. I mean, we never know. They choose sometimes to make an example of some and not others. I don't know. I really have no investment in like the sort of legal, juridical justice system in this country. Because the other thing that's complicated, this is also why it's always difficult for me to watch these trials, is because if I really do truly believe in abolition, as much as I want to say fuck all these motherfuckers, it's also still an internal contradiction to be wishing, hoping for them to go to jail. And it's not to say that I don't want them to, have to deal in some kind of way for their behavior, but it's a contradiction that I haven't figured out how to reconcile entirely. And so, there's that.
Yeah, I mean, like my man Yannick always says, it's a colony. You know, I mean, he's not the only one that said this, but he's good at reminding us this is a colony. So it's if it's a colony, then we should treat it as such, and not expect there to be any justice in a colony because it's a colony. With that being said, if just looking at the case itself, they're trying to argue the citizen's arrest angle or something of that nature, basically to say that the guys were attempting to arrest Ahmaud Arbery because he was trespassing in a home. That's the case of the arguments. It was so bad that the first prosecutor, they're on their fourth prosecutor for this case, because like the first two prosecutors are basically just not even willing to charge them because one of them actually wrote a defense for them saying that this is based on a citizen's arrest. And now I guess they got somebody in there who's calling bullshit on that. But they didn't even know that he was in this. Basically, he was running, and they claim he went into this home, and he was like looking around this home that hadn't been fully built, and then he was, and then they were trying to, I guess, get him from, stop him from trespassing or something. But trespassing is a misdemeanor, so even if it was a policeman, this is just based on their own law, it would have just been a warning. It wouldn't have required anybody to pull out a gun or anything of that nature. So they weren't even within the context of their own law. The colonial law in this case. But as far
those
as the
ass white people, they always stopping and being in goddamn business,
doing entirely too much,
and they didn't even know. Court. I was listening to the closing case of the prosecution. Even they were saying these people didn't even know that he had been in this house when they pulled him over. This is something they're trying to add retroactively to make an argument that they were trying to do something. But like I said, it's just racial hunting. So I don't think if it's very possible that they are found guilty because like I think CBS said that the ground is kind of shaky just based on their argument. So it's very possible at the same time, like they're basically trying to cancel the moms, the judge basically trying to cancel the moms for crying in the courtroom, saying that she's causing a stir. Like there's a lot of stuff. This is in Southern Georgia, right? So there's just a lot of stuff.
Case, the one where the prosecutor also said,
"Yep,
they
to keep them black ass preachers out there.
Yep,
keep them black ass motherfucking preachers out of here. They're intimidating the jury.
Yep, because they were trying to comfort.
They want to have one, they can have one.
They were trying to comfort the mother for crying. That was the same. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like so it could go either way, but I think whatever disappointment people have, they should continue. Like whatever disbelief you have in the system should not change regardless of the verdict. Right, that's my position. Like so if you think if the system doesn't work or whatever people can say that it does work but it doesn't work for us, if you think it's bullshit, let's just say that, then that's the position you should hold.
Same energy.
Yeah, keep that energy. There's nothing should change. Nobody should be any happier or sadder based on the verdict. Now I understand for the family and for people related. Even to take an abolitionist position, I don't give a fuck about vigilantes and cops. I don't care what happens to them. That's just, even if I'm calling myself an abolitionist, I don't care what happens to them. But I'm just saying, like, I get them wanting what, even if it's just some sense of closure, whatever it is. But it's not justice. So I don't think you can expect anything to really happen from that. And I just think that we have to be honest that that's just what it is. And I think with I remember years ago when Mike Brown, when that case happened, if there was this small, like, low-key kind of like compromise where like, okay, we're going to claim Mike Brown was the demon and he was running at the cop and all of this, but we're going to indict the police department and say that they were overcharging people on tickets and whatever. And that kind of like solved it enough where people were like, okay, we got something, but Mike Brown's, what was his name? Darren Wilson still gets off, so you might get a split like that here where, yeah, you got Kyle Rittenhouse, but Ahmaud Arbery's killers get some like smaller charge or something of that nature. And then lastly, did y'all know, I just saw this last night, Kyle Rittenhouse claims he's a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement. He's not a racist. He said this on Tucker Carlson.
Dope. I mean, the fascists are claiming they're not Nazis, so I get we can just split these hairs, but yeah, I think that your point is really important. No matter the outcome in any of this shit, I feel the same thing, the same way about the Chauvin outcome. Is like, this is not about justice. This is just about whether or not these motherfuckers are going to be convicted or not, right? Just like I don't believe, like people were saying that, okay, now that Chauvin was convicted, that will be, it's a message or a deterrent for other cops. No, it's not. Stop. We got to really disabuse ourselves of that logic. It is not. It is not. And I guess similarly, I don't think that Rittenhouse is going to be a catalyst one way or the other. I just don't. These white folks always do what they want. It's just, if we believe that this is a colony, the laws are applied arbitrarily to Black folks. It's completely arbitrary, right? That's the nature of colonial violence. It's arbitrariness. And the white folks are going to do what they do irrespective. Some get sacrificed to the system for whatever valence of order. Some don't. And so I just think that it's not. These are just
ultimately they're battling with each other. They ain't battling over.
Yeah, and it's not. I won't say they're just show trials, but it's just kind of like, I think that it's just what value should we ascribe to jurisprudence is basic. That's basically kind of the question. Other than that, it's like, I don't actually know. So
yeah, I think Yannick says something. I was listening to an interview. He was like, the only difference is, he's like, you have the liberal white supremacist order, which is what runs everything, and then you have the white supremacists, or he called white nationalist activists, who are always trying to pull it further to the right than it already is, but it's to the right? Like, it's not this like left right discourse. Like, that's bullshit. Like, so you always have a group of people who are like, we want to go past just this kind of liberal state, which is like a compromise. We want to completely like wipe out anybody who's not white. Like, and if you study like white nationalists, which we do talk about in episode 2, like I'm talking about the people who call themselves white nationalists. I'm not talking about the general ideology, but people who call themselves that, who like identify openly as such, not like a Joe Biden who practices it but doesn't call himself that. The people who identify openly is that, like, they feel they're very much anti-government. They feel like America is actually a failed state. It's not looking out for the white man, and they believe that they need to take over and do something else. If you read stuff like the Turner Diaries and stuff like that, like, they want to go somewhere else. So there are different elements of white supremacy that, like Layla said, are fighting amongst themselves, and we should be aware of that. And that's why that continuum is good, because it shows you like how things can escalate even worse than what they already are. But it's all white supremacy. We should just understand like where some of them are trying to take it, and then realize what we need to do to fight back against that, or fight for what we want. But this isn't a matter of like one side is doing justice and the other is not. Like, the whole shit's fucked up. Like, that just needs to be clear.
Yeah, and the We Charge Genocide petition, which I write about, they talk about the Dixiecrats and then the Truman wing of the Democrats, and how they're two sides of the same coin. Because what that white extremism does is make liberalism seem like progress by design, when actually you don't have to do shit, just as long as you're not like, kill all the niggas. You're fine. You're doing something good, even if you can do exactly nothing. And if we look at the Biden administration and the essentially nothing that they're doing, we can see how these two need each other for real. And that's why it's an internecine struggle. Like, they're struggling over balance of power. It's not about, protecting us in any regard. So
it never has been. And in fact, we should actually just continue to let them fight it out, because what has happened historically in the case of the world wars, when the whites fight it out amongst themselves, we tend to get our shit together in other ways. So let the motherfuckers fight.
Yeah, that did open up a lot of things. Yeah. So
period. That's like world systems, and that's part of the sort of development and underdevelopment analysis, that when you look at when the satellites, or whatever you want to call them, the periphery, the global south, the third world has made most progress, is when white domination has had to loosen its grip, because they are trying to reapportion the wealth that they stole.
And that's why they usually have these conferences, even something like the Berlin conference or something. Like, it's not that was the
we got to get back on the same page, guys. We're losing too much.
Exactly. Or the Congress of Vienna. Like, these are moments where they come together to be like, all right, we need to stop like fighting too much, because we fucking up everybody's money, right? Like, that's
Yes.
Yeah, that's the G20. That's
they got called to the table.
Yeah.
So just,
right.
shifting gears a little bit, like, can you speak a little bit, Layla? I know like this is your bailiwick, about the sort of the Venezuela elections and the outcomes and what this means in the context of the failed N15 counterinsurgency in Cuba on the one hand, and then the Nicaragua elections on the other hand. So like, where we at?
So in Venezuela, it largely turned out in favor of the PSUV. I mean, last week. We talked a little bit about some of the internal left kind of critiques, and there were. I mean, if you go look, Venezuela Analysis was doing like minute by minute coverage of the elections. There are some some issues and some accusations from the further left groups about some polling control things in terms of the PSUV and the left groups, but I think so. What is it? I'm reading this from Venezuela Analysis. It says Venezuela's mega elections first bulletin results: 90% of voting centers have reported, and that there was about a 41.8% turnout. I want to say this: that I was actually shocked to see that number. Well, not shocked, but I do remember that like when Chavez was in power, those numbers were like 80%. Like in terms of the percentages of people who were eligible to vote participating. And so again, that's a continuation of the conversation we had last time with what the sort of imposition of sanctions, what the kind of economic downturn, what this has sort of done to the nature of the democracy in Venezuela over the years. But largely the PSUV has remained in control. They retained governorship in 20 different states. The right-wing parties had a few small victories, but nothing significant enough to really upset sort of power relations. And so again, what this says to me is that in spite of the harshness that people in Venezuela have been living through under the sanctions, under COVID, under all this shit, that they still fundamentally believe in the ethos of the Bolivarian project, right? In this sort of move to the left, which is largely about, being able to be treated like human beings. And one of the things that, we didn't actually talk about the nature of elections in Venezuela, like in terms of the kind of formal processes of elections. But I tweeted this yesterday. Nick Estes has this kind of thread about the difference between elections in the US and elections in Venezuela. So I was there the last time Chavez was elected for the election process. And, it's one of the things that I really appreciated about seeing their approach to elections, which is very, very different from our approach to elections in the US. One of which is that Election Day is a national holiday. Two is that there is, they don't sell alcohol on Election Day. And I think part of that is just about trying to create a particular kind of, vibe throughout the day, and even, how people, and also in relationship to how people are voting, like the conditions under which they are voting when they go to the polls, that there is a central electoral council that monitors these processes and that also reports on these processes. So like in the US, we largely get results from presidential elections from news media sources, as opposed to a body that actually governs, creates controls around the electoral process. One of the other things that they do is attempt to make sure that people in remote areas have access to voting. So they actually create, they go to these places and as opposed to requiring people in these sort of rural, remote communities to come into towns to vote. And in addition to that, which I knew, but I didn't know exactly that they produce election materials in all of the languages that they understand to be spoken, right? So the election materials are produced in 33 different indigenous languages, in addition to Spanish, right? As opposed to in the US, you largely have to be literate in English, maybe Spanish, to participate clearly in the sort of voting process. And then there was also even, Nick Estes didn't tweet about this, but my understanding was that there was also a move to this kind of digitization process, whereby there was already a process by which they attempted to increase literacy in the country, but still that literacy is not a barrier to voting, if that makes any kind of sense. And so I think, this for me is more than anything is a vote in favor of not returning to what life was like pre-Bolivarian Revolution. Whatever kinds of ongoing contradictions, whatever kinds of issues that still need to be solved, that ultimately, when the people of Venezuela keep showing up and turning out, even in decreasing numbers, there's a clear statement there that says the U.S. needs to stay the fuck out their business. The U.S. and the rest of the West.
Yeah, that 41% is jarring to me. I'm like, what? That's like US numbers, And so I think that does show the toll that the economic downturn and sanctions are having in terms of, and even just there's a just global sense of disillusionment writ large as we regroup. But nonetheless, as you're saying, like, to the extent that they're showing up for not Western imperialism, period, right?
Exactly.
Well, thank you for that report.
All righty. All right, y'all. So for this week's planting thoughts, we have the pilea. So this plant is sometimes known as a Chinese money plant, but I don't really like referring to that because I was looking at the history of why it's called that, and I think it has something to do with some random ass fucking Norwegian missionary that was somewhere in China and took a clipping of the plant back. So this plant is a pilea, referred to as a pilea. I chose this plant this week because I've been hearing y'all talk about how y'all struggle with y'all's plants, and this particular plant was about to take me out. When I first got this plant 2 months ago, it was quite full, and like just every day, leaves were dying, just dropping left and right, left and right, left and right. And recently, I moved it into my window on top of a heater, and I think part of the one thing about plants in the wintertime is you need to water them a lot less, because they're not getting as much sun and as much warmth, so the soil is not drying out as much. And what I realized, as soon as I moved it into the window and over the heater, I started getting some new growth. I don't know if you can see it, but the way this plant grows, like they have what they call these pups, and they just kind of pop out. Oh, I can't show it. They kind of pop out everywhere in the soil. You see it right there. And they just kind of randomly pop up. And so I wanted my sort of thought for planting thoughts this week with this plant is to, one, when things aren't going right and you're struggling, you have to sometimes take a step back, regroup, think about what you need to move around and what sort of environments are better suited. And so this particular plant is actually pretty easy as long as you make sure it gets a lot of good light, but not direct sunlight, and has enough warmth and don't overwater it. So this is our plant for the week, the pilea. Okay, so you all know that we have decided to focus on a book every third episode. And so for this episode, we have the pleasure of speaking with Bob Brown on this new work, We Demand the Full Disclosure and Digitization of All Slavery Era Records, that has recently been published in 2 volumes. So Bob Brown is an organizer, lecturer, researcher, and writer. He is a former member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a founder of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and an organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC. Bob worked with Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, from 1967 until his untimely death in 1998. He was the national coordinator of logistics for the 1995 Million Man March. He served as a national director of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania's 2000 and 2004 election campaigns. As a lecturer for the past 44 years, Bob has delivered presentations throughout Africa, the African diaspora, and the world. As a researcher and writer for the past 40 years, he has authored and coordinated the publication and distribution of billions of pieces of educational materials and helped organize thousands of education events. He is also the editor of Stokely Speaks, From Black Power to Pan-Africanism. So we would like to welcome you today. How
Welcome.
are you?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. So let's dig right in. Okay, so this is sort of a background question. So the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances, which took place in Durban, South Africa, and some of the outcomes of that conference have an important relationship to this present project. Could you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between what kind of came out of that moment and this new book project?
Well, to do it very briefly, that was the Third World Conference Against Racism. UNESCO, which is a division related to the United Nations, is educational, social, and cultural organization, had been working since its founding for 3 or 4 decades, about 3, almost 4 decades, to deal with the questions of racism and xenophobia and intolerance and racial discrimination. They also were pioneers of the whole question of African history and other kinds of studies and whatnot, going back to the 1940s and 1950s. And they helped finance much of what is now known as African studies and Afro-American studies. They founded the creation of the various museums, African museums throughout the world. They helped rebuild monuments like Goree Island and the whole tourist industry. They played a very vital role. They were part of the process with various countries in Africa and in the Caribbean, Cuba, Senegal, Zimbabwe. We can name a bunch of countries. Going earlier, Ghana, Guinea, Egypt, you name it. The United Nations voted to do the Third World Conference, which was held in Tanzania, South Africa, to commemorate the so-called transition of power in Tanzania with the release of Mandela from imprisonment and whatnot. There were a number of issues raised with respect to that conference. Over 10,000 delegates from every corner of the world, went to the conference. More than 3,000 of them from the United States. And the US government, Ford Foundation, a series of foundations paid over $10 million to make sure that NGO delegates went to the conference. The National Black United Front, which was led by Dr. Conrad Worrell and Viola Plummer and Roger Warren and Colette Penn, with the December 12th movement up in New York City, took a delegation called the Durban 400, which was independent of the official interracial, government-owned and corporate and foundation-owned delegation. I went over. I had been there the year before representing the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. I was, on paper at least, its national director in its presidential campaign. And we were able to win 3 parliamentary seats, nothing big. I then doubled back in 2001 to go to this World Conference Against Racism. I did not go with any delegation from the United States because I am not an American. And I refuse to go anywhere in the world under the name of Afro-American or American. I'm an African. And if we weren't able to go as an African, so I went as an ambassador of the International Indian Treaty Council and whatnot. And I made a decision. If I don't talk to you in the United States, why should I talk to you anywhere in the universe? So I deliberately went to airports. Most of the folks from the US went either through Accra or straight to Joburg or whatnot. I went up to Italy, crossed into Germany, down into Ethiopia, on into Zimbabwe, because I really did not want to have a discussion. I knew the fix was in. I knew it was sold out then. Long story short, they had a governmental session, and I could have went to the governmental session. Miriam Makeba, Kwame's wife, was one of the top delegates representing South Africa, and I could have went under her umbrella and whatnot, but I chose not to because the government, the ANC government, chose not to permit any of the opposition parties, left or right, in Azania to go to that meeting. And I thought that that was wrong. And I certainly was not going to sabotage or cut PAC's throat. I went to the non-governmental session as part of a joint delegation with PAC. And I don't want to belabor it, but we had tremendous support. We, of course, went with the International Indian Treaty Council, the Palestinian movement, the Ba'ath Party of Iraq, the Revolutionary Committees of Libya, the Dalit movement. I mean, a whole host of organizations in a number of countries around the world supported us and helped us in small ways. You know, nothing big because we don't accept money. You know, I live very modest because I refuse to be on the payroll of the various forces who have been paying the bills. I mean, I've never seen so much money being dispersed on the movement in 50 some years in the movement. I've just never seen it. And it's questionable what that money is for. Long story short, the non-governmental forces, you know, put together a Durban Declaration and program of action, a couple of 100 pages. I particularly had a problem with one paragraph, paragraph 13. That paragraph said that slavery and the slave trade, especially the so-called transatlantic slave trade, are crimes against humanity and should have always been so. Those 5 words, should have always been so, was the fix. Yes, slavery and the slave trade in all of its forms and trafficking in human beings, over 40 million people being trafficked today, are crimes against humanity. They have been so at least for the 20th and 21st century, at least maybe from 1884 Berlin Conference, the trafficking in white slavery, you know, I mean, the genocide, you know, the Holocaust. Yes, they have suddenly become illegal and suddenly become crimes against humanity and genocide and war crimes. But those 5 words, should have always been so, was the sellout. I had a problem because many of the movement forces and other forces worldwide, including the so-called reparations movement in the United States and worldwide, accepted that conclusion of those 5 words. They even came back to the United States and lied and said that the United Nations had declared it a crime against humanity. But that is not true. They neglected those 5 words, should have always been so. I thought it strange because anybody who knew anything about reparations, you know, going back to Napoleon and other forces worldwide, and anybody who knows the history of Angola with Queen Nzinga fighting against the Portuguese and fighting and other forces knew that it was illegal. They knew it was illegal and whatnot. All in PhDs and you don't know it's illegal? You know, what kind of research have you done and whatnot? And I just had real problems with these forces then, and I have them even more now and whatnot. They knew, they had been told that slavery was supposedly legal, and therefore you had nothing coming. You had nothing coming. You cannot get paid for something that is legal. They knew that. So even if you could not win the vote because the fix was in at the governmental level, at the United Nations, worldwide, you would at least continue the struggle. So I made a decision in September 3, 2021, to spend whatever time, whatever resources I had for the rest of my life, proving that the slave trade, at least, because it was much easier to prove the slave trade is illegal than to prove the variations of enslavement and slavery and whatnot, that it was illegal since at least the 10 Commandments. You know, I'm not religious, but I do read. And I do know that in 1983 canon law, the Catholic Church says slavery, the seventh commandment is against slavery and against trafficking. It has been misinterpreted and reinterpreted so many ways, so many times over the last 700 years. And in fact, it goes back several thousand years, because slavery did not begin in 1619. I'm tired of hearing people telling lies. The New York Times has a 1619 project, and they know damn well that Africans came into the Western Hemisphere with the Spaniards, with the conquistadors. I'm 73 years old, and I don't remember off the top of my head and whatnot. But, I go 2 feet behind me and get the books that talks about how a brother drove the ship that Columbus came on and whatnot, the folks who went into Mexico with Cortez and whatnot, and we go back further. So I'm kind of tired. I have been struggling. I've been doing other work, and so this has not been full time. I'm not financed. I just cussed out 2 people this week wanting to give me money. Can't give me money. You can't buy me. You can't control me. You can't own me. You may not know, I know, because I spend what little time I have, reading. So all I got, I don't have to get up in the morning. I don't have to get up in the morning. I've done my work. I've done my work. The folks who I helped get the PhDs better not play with me, because I will ask for their PhDs. You will not continue to tell lies to our youth. It will not. So let me fast forward. We went back into Chicago. A sister named Dorothy Tillman, who came to Chicago, I met her in 1965, when Dr. J. Archie Hargraves brought Jesse Jackson, Andy Young, James Bevel, C.T. Vivian. The SCLC folks came to town and pretended like there was no movement in Chicago before they arrived. But we won't get into that. I met Dorothy when she was about a year older than me. She came up to Chicago as a high school student from Mississippi and Alabama, and then SCLC in the South. And she worked with them in the campaigns and whatnot. And Harold Washington made her, an alderwoman, and made Bobby Rush an alderman and offered me one. And I told him I already got a job. I'm not working for the Democratic Party. I helped elect him and other forces because the Democratic Party did not want him to be mayor. And when we won, I never went into City Hall because I did not want to work for the party. I respected him. He's one of the few elected officials I do respect and whatnot, but I wasn't going to be paid. But Dorothy and Mayor Daley and Eddie Burke, I'm waiting to see Eddie go to jail. I fought the Daley machine since 1963, and I'm fighting Lloyd Lightfoot. I fought the Dawson machine, and I'm fighting Bob Rush, who I put in the movement, who I recruited to the Panther Party. and who's now doing whatever it is he's doing. But bottom line, his congressional district is ground zero in Chicago. I don't blame him for that. I'm not mad at him. He's powerless. He's powerless. Over 300,000 African people have been chased out of Chicago in the last 2 decades in his congressional district and Danny Davis. I don't think they're bad. I just think they're powerless. And I think they could have at least made some more noise. But leave that aside. They cut a deal. They passed a ordinance called the colloquial name, we call it the Dorothy Tillman Slavery Disclosure Ordinance. A college professor named Dr. Andy Thompson at Northeastern Illinois University, long story, he was a consultant for Dorothy, helping to write the ordinance, got paid to help write the ordinance, and came to me to do the research for free. I gave him 4 file boxes of files. First of all, I told him to go send somebody out to California to see Tom Hayden, because Tom Hayden had coined a series of bills dealing with Holocaust insurance and all kinds of tactics and strategies that the Jewish people were using, because Holocaust insurance and Holocaust bank money, and it was a major movement at that point in time. And the California state legislature pioneered different kinds of strategies, legally, with lawsuits in Europe, lawsuits here. I did the research. I told him, this is what they did. Perhaps you should see if there is something that could be used within that. One of the things I told them to move very carefully is the Jewish Holocaust laws had the right of private action through whistleblowers. Whistleblowers could discover fraud inside the government, and whistleblowers could take the case to court and sue on behalf of the government, on behalf of the people, and triple damages and whatnot. We hear about one group of whistleblowers, which are the Julian Assanges and the other forces who, for the most part, deal with national security questions and whatnot. But we don't hear about the whistleblowers who were suing for Medicare fraud, who there are all kinds of major contract fraud. We don't hear about them. The law comes from the Civil War. When the Union Army couldn't break through Virginia, so Abraham Lincoln and the government created the federal whistleblower law. And there's been a struggle since 1865, 60s, to have different whistleblower statutes federally, locally, state, and whatnot. Well, Chicago has some corruption in Black contractors who were fronting for the mob, and Daley hired Lori Lightfoot to come clean up the Black corruption, but she did nothing against the white corruption. So there's a history to it. So they created this law. There were all kinds of lawsuits, against, corporations and whatnot. All kinds of Freedom of Information Act requests demanding that slavery records be disclosed. Very simple. Disclose the records of all your predecessor entities. They did not implement that law. The law became effective in 2003. Between 2003 and 2006, 8 other cities in one county passed the law: Philadelphia, Detroit, Wayne County, Milwaukee, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Berkeley, Richmond, Oakland, California. So here is these laws. John Streeter in Philadelphia voted for it and refused to implement it. Kwame Kilpatrick in Detroit refused to implement it. Ron Dellums had just become the mayor-elect of the city of Oakland, he was Berkeley, and refused to implement it. The Congressional Black Caucus refused to implement it. They want to play with me? No. You did nothing to implement it. You could have at least made more noise. So lay that aside.
Wait, hold on. Can you just take a quick detour to speak a little bit more about reparations, since reparations is sort of the big topic right now? You got in Crowborough.
Reparations was a hustle.
Can you say more, please?
First of all, reparations is a war term. The countries who have won the war demand reparations to repay the cost of the war, of the crimes. You know, Germany paid reparations twice.
Except Haiti. Haiti won and then paid reparations to France.
That is not reparations.
Okay.
Yes, they paid, but they won, but they paid. There's a difference, because if it had been reparations, France would have paid them. And the reparations bill, when you talk about the interest, why are they just talking about the country, France? What about the banks who collected the interest? Many of these reparations bills going back 100 years, 200 years, the interest is just being paid in this generation's lifetime. And nobody's talking about that. Okay? Nobody's talking about that. And when the bills from the Civil War, the interest has just been paid. There are classrooms. There's a professor that was down in Hawaii about 10 years ago. He had one of the only classes that I'm aware of in this country that talked about the true cost of the Civil War. You know, the Freedmen's Bureau, you know, and Secretary of War Stanton, there are documents saying how much Secretary Stanton wore when he did the Confiscation Act. You don't sit up and say we're confiscating all of the wealth of the South. And the wealth of the South is in human beings, in so-called people who are enslaved, you know, without knowing a figure. The US government created the US Census. One of its first issues was to count the number of African people who were enslaved, to be able to charge 2/3 for taxation purposes. We were 2/5 of a man. They didn't even count the women. They didn't count the Indians. They just counted the enslaved men as 2/3 for taxation purposes. And in order to the Electoral College, anybody who supports the Electoral College today knows nothing about the history of the Constitution in the United States and the deals that were cut between the Northern Congress people and the Southern Congress people that in effect kept the South in control of this country and the Congress until 1965, with the so-called, you know, one-party South. And when this is nothing new, and it has been studied. Anybody knew that in 1860 in New Orleans, the price of an African male who was enslaved was $1,000 US. Yearly wages of white folk was $100. a year. But they buy us for life. And we work 20 to 40 years, sun up to sundown, we were $1,000. If you take $1,000, they get websites that'll tell you $1 in 1860 is worth X amount of dollars today. So why we got to ask for money to figure out how much to ask for? How you go on WorldCat, you type in slavery, you type in slave trade, you get 500,000 hits. I'm crazy enough to try to collect all of them and try to read all of them. You know, I know that's impossible. I know most of them are lies. Most of them are lies, including ones written by Black folk, PhDs, you know, and whatnot. They're lies because they have not done the research. They have not done it. I know it was harder years ago to get access to primary documents. We certainly didn't have the resources to do the travel, you know, the Xeroxing. I certainly didn't. You know, it has become easier today because more and more documents are being digitized and being made available online. You don't even have to go to the library no longer, especially during the pandemic, because billions of dollars are being appropriated, you know, to digitize. I mean, the educational system in this country and worldwide has gone digital. Not 100%, but certainly it will never go back to the way it was and whatnot. I mean, the technology progresses. The fact that we're on this program now. You know, you in Germany, Layla? You know, I'm sitting in North Carolina. You sitting wherever you're sitting. The fact that, you know, the fact
Chicago.
That, okay. So I'm just saying, that shows you the level of technology. The issue of reparations, first of all, I make the argument that reparations, if they should be handed out, are for historical crimes. Crimes are being committed today. You know,
Can I bring us back to the book just for a second?
Okay.
So I wanted no, because
I ain't finished with the reparations movement yet.
So that's what I wanted to ask.
But go ahead.
So you started to talk about the process of filing the lawsuits, which, you know, for those people who haven't read the book yet, that the book is documenting this process by which you start to attempt to file these lawsuits based on what was the whistleblower and public disclosure. And so what I wanted to ask you about that, about the book project, is what do you, one, to kind of talk a little bit more about what you were aiming to prove through the process of filing the lawsuits, and then what you hope to accomplish from the publication of documenting this process.
First of all, that's not the most important work.
Okay.
So that's just part of the ongoing process. The law basically said that any entity that does business, not just business, churches, you name it, any entity that does business with these various jurisdictions, the city of Chicago being the primary one, had to, as part of their government contracting process, they had to sign an affidavit affirming under oath that they had researched any and all of their predecessor entities going back to the so-called slavery era, and that they certified under oath that they found no record of slavery, of enslavement, of profits. That's number one, or they certified that they found records, they found information, and they disclosed all of them. If they did not, if they lied on this affidavit, they could be, their contracts voided. They could be prevented from doing business with the city of Chicago, these cities, and they would have to pay fines. That's the law. Daley bragged and said he knew there was very little of that in Chicago. There was no slavery, blah, 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 blah. He bragged. Eddie Burke with his lying ass, and I'm waiting. Every day I get up to see if they locked him up that day, because he on his way to jail. He just been in power so long. He too powerful, too big in prison, and whatnot. So he going. He on his way. They just locked Vajoliak up and whatnot with the council wars. So it's corruption and whatnot. So what I did, number one, I researched every vendor in the city of Chicago. If you sold marijuana or African jewelry on the street corner of Chicago and paid a fine, you got researched. Because I wanted to find as diverse a group of forces as I could. I searched over 3,000 vendors. And I had to, number one, find which ones had contracts, because you had to have a contract with money from the city of Chicago. That eliminated a lot of targets who simply didn't have business with the city of Chicago. Like it was difficult to find a sugar company that had direct business with the city of Chicago, even though sugar is in the cafeteria, in the schools, and sugar is in the jails, and sugar is in the offices and whatnot. So I had to be creative to find these businesses and whatnot. And then once you found that they did business with the city of Chicago, you had to prove that they had predecessor entities who did business during the so-called slavery era, okay? And then you had to prove that there were records that existed which could be released, okay? So given that criteria, I filed one set of lawsuit, federal lawsuit, in the federal courthouse in 2004. Essentially slavery disclosure, consumer fraud. I just said you lied to the African community. If you're gonna sit up and tell us you didn't have no slaves, you're lying to us. That's consumer fraud. So it was a question of how do you find standing? Once you decide to go into a courthouse, you have to find a way to get in the door and stay in the door as long as you can stay in with your legal strategy and whatnot. So bottom line, I identified 112 defendants. And they are not, it was not Afro-American. I'm not an American. Not an American slave. I can't deal with that confusion and whatnot. That sets us back further than we ever been in a long time. We'll get back to that and whatnot. So I knew who the victim. The Catholic Church created slavery. We talk about Christopher Columbus, but for the most part, we only talk about the enslavement of indigenous people. And then people got nerve to tell me Indians don't deserve no reparations. sister I've been working with for 20 years in the Netherlands told me 2 or 3 weeks ago that Africans was in the Western Hemisphere before the Indians came here. I told her, you gonna run that Israeli mess on me? People before the people, people without a land, without a people. She done went further. Them ADOS people came to me, we American descendants of slaves. I told them, well, you got the wrong one. I have not liked America since I was an adult. I did not go to Vietnam. I don't vote for Barack Obama. And I'm gonna sue Megan too. How you gonna? Our family was here before the American Revolution. One of our ancestors on our fathers was Chicken George in Georgetown, South Carolina, with the swamp fox. As a teenager, doing Francis Marion, the swamp fox, the George Washington of South Carolina. They got mad with me. I told them, I don't know who y'all are, but I'm a royal ex-slave. It ain't many who can say they was from George Washington's plantation or from, Francis Marion. How you gonna play with me? It was not. We was here before there was the United States. Declaration of Independence. What the hell is that? I can go say I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, all I want to. But if there's a signature of a judge, a signature of a priest, I'll be like James Brown, wondering when they're gonna bury me. You're not divorced. You're not divorced. You understand what I'm saying? This is confusion. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, is when the United States became a government. And I don't think Betsy Ross, the slave, had sold that flag by then. I forget the date. I don't think Betsy Ross sold it. Why would she sue? Why? So this is confusion. Our ancestor was descendant of the French Huguenots, living in South Carolina when it was British. And how you gonna tell me I can't sue Meghan and Harry? It's understood that the Royal African family was the British royal family. How you gonna sit up and tell me you don't know who to sue? We're gonna sue all white folk. All white folk ain't done that to us, but I'm just kind of tired of this hustle. This hustle, and that's all it is. And they are all mad with me. But to take it back, the lawsuit, the main one, that this book, 500-page complaint with 2,000 footnotes, we proved 549 counts of fraud. We named the contract, the number, the date, the amount, what it was for. That's why the complaint is 500 pages. We listed 549 contracts totaling $3.9 billion on 112 corporation entities for 3 years, 2003 to 2006. We showed 549 perjury. You lied and you said you had no slavery records to disclose, or you disclosed them. We proved it. We proved that you had predecessor entities. The academicians, Emory University, Jeremy Voss down there, and Emory and History Associates and the bank over there, and they come, the law says predecessor entities. They coined another one, legacy banks. The word legacy bank ain't nowhere in the document. They came up with some fraudulent methodology shit, excuse my language. You know, they figured out that they do corporate history in lawsuits. You know, when a corporation is sued for asbestos violations, they find slick trick maneuvers to wiggle out of it and whatnot. And they use those techniques and tricks in the legal game, in the corporate legal game, to wiggle out of. And people let them go. People let them go. They did not challenge them. They did not argue with them. To give you some examples, the Archdiocese of Chicago, I made a cold decision, a political decision. Bob Brown versus the Archdiocese of Chicago. And the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, of Detroit, of Los Angeles, of the Bay Area, San Francisco, because those were the main archdioceses. I didn't want to sue them because for the most part, they receive social service money for AIDS, Meals on Wheels, you know, basketballs at midnight to keep kids from going to jail. I mean, for the most part, it's social service programs. And the people have a right to those social service programs. It ain't reparations. It's human rights. It's social service delivery. I'm tired of people telling me that the stimulus check is reparations. It's not. It's not. It's a social, it's a right that every human being deserves from the moment they are conceived, not just born. The moment they, even before prenatal, it's a human right. You know, so I didn't want to confuse it. I didn't want no single mother chasing me down Highway 95, talking about that nigga stole my welfare check, my baby's diaper money, no. That's no. That was not reparations money. We wasn't gonna win it. I knew that. But they don't tell you that I also said under oath that if we won the money, I would not take the money. And I wouldn't pay for no welfare either. I didn't do that mess in the Panther Party. And I come to build an all-black political party. Ain't nobody gonna trick me into serving no grits and margarine. I fell out with Fred Hampton and Bob Rush in 1968 over that one. Ain't nobody gonna run that one on me again at 73. I was 20 then. I know better. They don't know how many people I've fed, how many proposals I've written, how many daycare centers, how many. I just helped set up International Comparative Labor Studies Department, first one on all African college campus in the United States in Morehouse. Told them where to go get the money, who to go to get the money from, and tell them I don't even want to say hello to them. Because they're working for people that I don't work for. I don't take no George Soros money. I don't trust nobody who do. even if they made a mistake. I don't take no Ned money. I have problems with some of them. I understand. I don't condemn a college student for taking no Ford Foundation money, although I know the Ford Foundation is the CIA. They can take it. I can't. I can't. And whatnot. I understand. I don't have no problem with you taking a welfare check, a social security check, although I didn't earn none. I don't get none. And whatnot. So there are ways to deal with it. The Catholic Church said that in Chicago, said they had no relationship to slavery. I forget the amount of money, but it was over $1 million that they had received. And that was the biggest number, because they had a lot of small grants. And each time you sign a grant, you tell that lie. The trick they played, you don't know how they worked me. They played the shell and the pea game. You don't know how many times I had to refile the complaint because I didn't have the name right. I didn't have the name. Archdiocese of Chicago, the Catholic Bishop of Chicago, this one, that one. What name? The Archbishop refused to accept the subpoena. Much as they arrested us and played with us, they don't think I know how. I hired the biggest black private detective with a gun and said, go find the Archbishop. Serve him. You're not playing with me with that one. They would not let me serve the Democratic and Republican Party because they're not a monolith. The Chicago Democratic Party is not the same legally as the Cook County Democratic Party, although the Daley brothers owned and controlled it, and is not the same as the state. So the judge, she cried, but she let me serve the Catholic Church. But when I came to court, she said, your attempt to serve the Democratic and Republican Party has been quashed. Now, that's a very strong term to say, it's quashed, to show you how they did not want that contradiction. Long story short, I proved. The Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of Chicago, had I did the genealogy of the Catholic Church worldwide. I showed the relationship of Chicago to Durango, Mexico, to Baracoa, Cuba. The Archdiocese of Chicago used to be managed at one point in history from Cuba. It went from Chicago to St. Louis to Durango to Seville to the Vatican. That's one stream. It went from Chicago to St. Louis to New Orleans to Havana, Cuba, Bula, Cuba, Seville, the Vatican, another stream. It went from Chicago up to Montreal to Rouen, France, into the Vatican. And it went from Chicago into St. Louis, into Louisville, Kentucky, into Indianapolis, Indiana, Baltimore, Maryland, Westminster, UK, into the Vatican. So that shows the Pan-African, the international connection. I sued American Airlines, I sued British Airlines to get the royal family of Britain. And I sued the boys And I will most definitely have somebody serve Megan.
So we're running up on time for our interview, but I guess the last question that I have is, can you speak about the importance of digitization? Because part of what you're pushing for is not only to amass these records, but to digitize them. And you spoke earlier about how we've moved toward a more digitized world. And so what is so important about having these records digitized so that folks can have access to them?
That is what makes it important, access. Only a small group of people are financed to do archival research. It's very hard to get those kinds of grants. And even if you get a small one, it's never really enough because you can't afford to travel. You know, I mean, the records aren't, you just can't get a bus pass and go up the street to a university. Most of them will not even let you in because you don't have access. You're not a student, you're not a researcher, you're not a professor. So you do not have access because they're not digitized. Dun & Bradstreet has over 1 million records. The smoking gun for the reparations movement, if they really want to know who the money in the South between 1840 and 1865, go up to the Harvard Business School library and ask to see the sealed Dun & Bradstreet records. What plantation in my Bayou, Mississippi in 1850 needed a credit report that didn't have something to do with slavery? They will tell you, I mean, it's no secret. Every Catholic church in every corner of the world must keep records. Many of the records are at Notre Dame, at the 3 Catholic universities in Chicago, and in the main archdiocese. We don't have the ability to get to them. But if they're digitized, a kid can sit under a banana tree in the Congo, with a cell phone and do research. Academia.edu is one example of a digital source. They have 40 or 50 million members organized by research interest groups. One of the interest groups is piracy. They have 9,000 PhDs and researchers and graduate students and new students, 9,000 members in one research interest group. You look at so-called African American history, 30,000 members. I get at least 100 documents a day because I have an alert. Anytime they mention Stokely Carmichael's name, but I got a list of good stuff and I got the most wanted list. I'm on the obituary section and I got a computerized list of people I get up every morning to see if they're still here. I couldn't get that if I had to buy the newspaper. I don't have that kind of budget. So the question of access in a global sense, but more important than access is who has access. It ain't just the people I mean, if I had reparations money, I wouldn't hire nobody who had anything higher than a high school diploma, because they already been miseducated. I saw your
I'm
eyes.
applying anyway. You can re-educate me because I'm applying.
I mean, if you already paid, why you need more? Do you know how many people there are in this country and worldwide who are researching slavery and the slave trade? How many people you know got books on slavery and slave trade and making 5 or 6 digits? Do they really need more? I mean, I'm not opposed to them getting it, but wouldn't it make sense for them to spread it around and give some more kids? I mean, they can go and get their mansions and all that stuff that they're not taking the hell with them. They're not taking it with them. But I don't mind them getting it. You don't know how many I've helped get it. But that's the point at which there is greed.
Oh, I would work for free. I would donate my time. Don't worry.
No,
I don't need more money.
The ones who I know, the ones who I'll name, they know who I'm talking about. I mean, we are not slaves. We were enslaved. If you say that we are slaves, then you say we were legally enslaved. How can you demand reparations and then call yourself an American descendant of slaves? How can you do that? You undercut the demand. You may get paid to say that. Somebody may buy your book. That don't make you my leader. I've seen trillions of dollars handed out in the movement in the last 73 years, and I ain't seen a financial report. You can represent yourself, and you have no obligation to tell me what you make or what deal you cut. But you can't claim to represent me unless you give me a financial report. Where is the financial report from the reparations movement? They don't want to make me mad.
But on that note, I do want to make sure that I call attention to the fact that one of the forthcoming projects out of this work is the forthcoming book is going to be God Makes No Slaves in the Womb, to my knowledge, right? And I just wanted to, if you could maybe in about 5 minutes or so, just talk about what that project is, and then we'll close out from there.
First of all, that is the main book. It's an accident of history that this book got published after 15 years, but leave that aside. Basically, the issue becomes, did God make slaves in the womb? It's an old 1850s abolitionist slogan, Reverend John Fee, Berea College. I won't go through that because it's too long. If God made slaves in the womb, the master narratives say that there are 3 essential ways somebody can be enslaved: war, debt, maybe 4, war, debt, sell yourself, 1, 2, 3. But one of the ways was a child of a woman who has been enslaved. That's what they claim is the main stuff. From 1811 to 1898, all of the major Latin American countries in Central and South America passed what they call free womb laws, which basically said a child in the womb is free. Okay? The Protestant movement in the United States, the American Missionary Association in 1850, with Reverend Fee and Marcus Aurelius Clay, who Muhammad Ali was named after, one of the biggest slave masters in Kentucky. The American Missionary Association asked Reverend Fee to do a manual to train a new generation in the 1850s of anti-slavery preachers. And he wrote a book called, manual, anti-slavery manual, blah, blah, blah. And one little section raised the question, did God make slaves in the womb? A so-called debate between him and a pro-slavery preacher. Well, my argument is if God made slaves in the womb, then it's all right to do abortions. And the Pope gonna have to talk to me about that. Yeah, it was not. If God did not make slaves in the womb, how could a Pope do it? God gonna have to talk to me. The Pope gonna have to talk to me. And what's the great white hope, the Catholic preacher up there in Chicago who helped Fred Hampton feed children? Father Flegger. He gonna have a conversation with me. Okay? So to do it quickly, this book, bottom line, is 6 major chapters. Chapter 1 is an open letter to the Catholic Church worldwide, to the King Felipe VI of Spain and the President of Portugal and the Portuguese and Brazilian royal family, the Spanish royal family, and all of the countries and ports in the world. Portuguese Empire, Spanish Empire. It asked the Pope to repeat. Since 1984, the Indians have been demanding the repeal. They'll just toss out all the papal bulls of discovery. It's a major, major movement financed by all the major Protestant churches in the United States and in Europe, and 13 Catholic Church institutions, including Loreto. The Jesuits just gave $100 million to the 10,000 descendants of the 220 some odd Africans who were the last ones enslaved to pay for Georgetown University. But if 10,000 Africans are worth $100 million, I don't have no problem with that. Then tell me how many people in Brazil was by the Jesuits, how many in Angola, how many in Guinea-Bissau, how many in Cuba. You cannot tell me that an African in the United States is worth more than an African in the Congo. I'm a Pan-Africanist. You can't tell me that. But I'll never buy it. I'll never buy it. And whatnot, okay? So that's the first chapter. Chapter 2 is basically the British Empire. You can't tell me that we came here in 1619. You can't limit me to the United States government when I can prove we were enslaved by the British here, our family. You can't produce your genealogical record. We can at least present a little bit of ours. You can't tell me. And you can't tell me the contribution our family. We had a bishop integrated the white Methodist Church in the 1930s in the Southwest, a Black bishop in an all-white territory. He was more powerful than Martin Luther King. When King met him in the 50s, King kissed his ring. I'm not saying nothing negative to King. You just can't tell me who we are. If we don't go around bragging, how you know? How you know? We were some of the first students at Russ College. The plantation that our family was liberated from in Mississippi is now called Ole Miss. I have a right to go down there and tell Ole Miss, I want this, I want that, I want the other. And get it. And get it. They ain't gonna play this Howard University game. So bottom line, you got the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Catholic. You got the US, the whole British Empire, including Jamaica. Sir Hilary Beckles is gonna get a letter. He may be a good brother, but he is part of the royal establishment. All people with madam and sirs going to at least be questioned, at least spend a night in jail and whatnot. You asked me to do this, now you know I didn't want to do this. Ain't no need to half doing it, you know. You half doing it, you know. I'm going to ask Mellon Foundation to withdraw the money from that fool up there at Harvard. And then people down there in Emory. How you gonna pay $3 million over 40 years for people to digitize lives? You tell me the paper bull of demarcation, you can stop me whenever you want. The paper bull of demarcation, 1493, and the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, says Spain could not, a Spanish flag ship could not dock in Africa, in no port, 280 some ports in Africa, and they could not dock there, which is why they had to do ascentios. So this is what I've been taught all my life. Spain could not have a slave trade directly from Africa. Yet at Emory, they document 1,888 ships embarking like on a Danish cruise, 1.1 million Africans on Spanish flagged ships from Africa. How can you embark 1.5 million people? It's illegal. There's no Cuban slave trade. Cuba didn't exist until the 1880s. There was a Spanish slave trade and British and other slaves, US took Cuba. There's no disrespect to Cuba. We just need to be precise.
Yeah, it sounds like.
So this,
No,
bottom line, these are letters. And it's just showing these documents. Here are the primary source documents. Confirm. You know, I ain't too smart. You know, this is what y'all told me. This is what I've been taught. Confirm the truth or correct me and release the files.
I think that's. No, I was gonna say. I think that's the good place to pause the conversation. I'm sure that it will continue.
And let me just do this one. Vladimir Putin gonna get a letter too. Because Russia and Germany and other Baltic countries were part of the transatlantic slave trade. Very small. but they were part of it. And if they're smart, they will admit the truth before the March elections.
Okay.
Imagine leaflets in Bobby Rush's, and Danny Davis, 4 Black congressional districts. Imagine if I just go sit in and hand out one leaflet.
Well, I think you have given all of us a lot to think about, a lot. I mean, and obviously this is clearly, I know your life's work, and it's a lot of labor being put into it. And I think it's important for us to continue to have this conversation about the importance over the disclosure of the information and setting the record straight, which I think is a lot of what you tried to do for us today. And so I just want to tell our, put to our audience that these are texts to engage with, these are narratives to engage with, and we wanted to say thank you today for taking the time to walk us through all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Okay.
All right, y'all, we're returning to another segment from season 1 called The Doctor's In, where essentially y'all write in with your questions, concerns, philosophical thoughts, and me and the good Dr. Layla address them. So, but before we do that, we actually just want to give a recap or, a rundown of how our Insight seminar went from Revolutionary Pan-Africanism or Racial Capitalism. And spoiler alert, it was lit. So Layla, you want to start off?
It was. Like I really enjoyed it. I was really happy. We had a really good turnout. I think somewhere around 40 people registered and a little over 30 showed up. I was really excited to see a number of our LDIers in the crowd. Some folks from my hometown were like old friends that I hadn't seen in a long time. But basically, I think we had some really good conversations. I was actually mostly excited about the number of people at the end of the seminar who wanted to figure out how to continue to stay in contact, who wanted more information about organizations to join, who seemed genuinely interested in what is it that we do with this information once we have it, right? So that, I think for me, those are some of the highlights from the weekend.
Mm-hmm. Well, I personally was super excited that Dr. Edward Onuchi was there. And he is the author of, was it Free the Land, the book on the Republic of New Africa, which is so lit. But just in true sort of humble scholar fashion, didn't monopolize space. We actually had to push him to contribute and to talk, not to contribute in terms, he was very engaged.
CBS had to call him out because that's what she will do. Don't be anywhere and know her, and she wants you to contribute and you try to be quiet because she will call you out. She did that to me when we were at her talk in Paris recently. So
it's true. So I said, excuse me, Dr. Onuchi, we would love to hear from you, especially as it relates to land. But anyway, so it was really cool that he showed up. And I really was impressed. We had a section where we broke folks up into small groups, and you never know how small group work will go. Because people could, you just never know. But like the groups were very engaged, very lit. They took the questions seriously. They even had their own sort of follow-up questions and other types of conversations. And so it just akin to what Layla was saying, it was really cool to see people like taking seriously the ideas that we were discussing and really concretizing what we were saying about revolutionary Pan-Africanism and racial capitalism. Because I know that for myself, being an academic, I can, get into the ideas and the theory and in my head, and that's just how I roll. And so it's always good to have people to be like, okay, but what are we going to do? How does this manifest in everyday life? And so yeah, it was just, I really enjoyed it and it was also really cool that the organizer of the Insight seminars actually participated. So he wasn't just, a passive observer. He was like, okay, I'm about to hop in this group and also participate. So that's just embodying the ethic of the seminar itself. I just thought that was really dope. So
And I think probably we were discussing after one of our takeaways was trying to actually figure out how do we continue to kind of recreate. So obviously we do this podcast as a way of, sharing what we're learning, making sure that there's like a flow of information that people have access to one another. But, the podcast can be a one-way medium because it's us talking to you all. And so it was actually nice to really have people ask questions and reflect on things, and us to think together. And so one of the things that we tried to end with was thinking about revolutionary futures, Pan-African futures. And so for me, I think that's something that maybe we will figure out how we incorporate into our life in LDI. Maybe think about, what some kind of live event or some kind of interactive event might look like in the future. So I definitely want to continue to have that vibe.
Yeah, absolutely. Something else that struck me though is it's interesting. So there's this sort of, I wouldn't even say tension, but there's a sort of interplay between the need to dream and to ideate and to imagine as you incorporate it into the seminar, Layla, and then the need for like action and practical steps. But it really strikes me how uncomfortable some people are with like the idea of dreaming, that it seems it seems too ideal, too abstracted, too whatever, impractical. But I think that we really need to be serious about that. We really actually do. It's not, we have to decolonize our imagination. So we're not just anti, but also know what we stand for. And so it was just really interesting to see how that played out with a few folks.
But all in all, it was a great experience. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as we did.
Yeah, and thank y'all for coming.
All right, so when we posted some of the clips from last week's show, we actually got a question that we decided we thought would be interesting for the doctors in the segment. So the question said, have you guys done a show discussing the dynamics of white concepts / theories in PhD programs and how they are suffocating for Black bodies, and what is some best practices for current students and post-graduating? So obviously, no, we've not done a show about that. But what do I want to say about this? So I know there was an initial, go ahead.
Yeah. Before we launch in, I didn't have to respond, not Black bodies, stop with the Black bodies, my guys, my girls, my sibs, my non-binaries, stop with the motherfucking Black bodies, please. We not a bag of bones, we are people. Period. If you don't like the human thing, fine, but we people. Like the Black bodies, you missed me with it. So I got distracted by that. But let's circle back to answer this question.
So I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed, even for people that don't even necessarily have any kind of radical revolutionary left politics. You'll be hard pressed to find Black people in PhD programs who don't feel the kind of weight of all the dead white men that we all had to read all the time. I think I'm of two minds about this. The first is that I mean, obviously, I don't think there's anything wrong with being familiar with, consuming, reading what the field is, and that it is also, we also have to understand like what these institutions are designed to do. And they are not actually designed to make us have any sense of ourselves as human beings. And I hate the notion of having to always tell ourselves that we have to do twice the work, but it's a reality. And when I say twice the work, what I mean is that we do have to read the shit to be able to refute it, one, and we have to engage the people, the thinkers that they don't know any fucking thing about. I remember distinctly when I was in graduate school, struggling with my committee over the fact that none of them were really familiar with any of the Pan-Africanist thinkers that I wanted to think with or write with. And so that even became part of my project. And I know somebody who did their PhD at UT Austin, and one of the decisions they made with their dissertation was to only cite Black authors in their entire dissertation, right? And so, I mean, I think I don't want to dismiss the way that it feels, crushing, demeaning, whatever, when, in the structures of these programs, we're constantly told that these are the only people that matter. But we also know that that's what we're up against. And so you have to make a decision about who you choose to engage to counter the fuck shit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll just keep it simple, stupid. Keep it simple, stupid. Believe your own analysis. Like, you know what these institutions are. You know the institutions are the intellectual arm of the state. They are largely racist, if not white supremacist, if not anti-Black. You know, they are largely patriarchal. All of those things hold true. And so, you know, as Layla was saying, it doesn't hurt to read what they say is knowledge, just keeping in mind that we know what it is. We know who we want to talk about. We know who we're talking to, and we know what we're doing the work for. And so it's just, it can't, and then this is why it is so important to join organizations or to have something anchoring you beyond the academy, because those are going to be the people who are affirming the type of work that you want to do. But it is important to engage the European canon, and not necessarily in your work, but just to know what you're refuting, because there's nothing, you cannot refute what you don't know. There's nothing worse than willful ignorance on either side. And so it does us no favors if you're trying to, if you're anti-Marxist, for example, you ain't never read Marx. That's goofy, right? It's just reproducing the same types of ignorance that we feel alienated by when they don't know the Black or the African thinkers. And so I just think, like, know what you're there for, know the work that you want to do, find community and like anchors outside of the people or the spaces that are delegitimizing it, and do your work. You're there to get the degree and access to resources that we can redistribute, and that's it. So
the last thing I'll say is that's also what the margins are for. I can't tell you how many of my books from grad school have what the fuck in the margins. Like, it's just part of my talking to myself on paper. And I think you just have to engage that shit and then have these conversations with them, to your point, Cerise, not just organizations, but also with other graduate students. I mean, far too many of us go through this shit alone and be feeling like we're the only people that feel like this shit, when so many of us feel like this. So maybe you just need some people to commiserate with.
Period. Who may or may not be in your department or even your discipline. Yep. All right, so the next question is from Twitter. So I had posted something about, whiteness being the most sort of potent identity politics. And so what I imagine is a European responded, I consider myself to be an ally to all who are anti-fascist, anti-austerity, an ally to all who know and experience racism. So having said that, I also know that the majority of my ancestry is from Europe, and I am also aware that the wealthy always tries to divide us. So how can we, who are mainly Euro-American in background, help the situation? Do we need to stop calling ourselves white? If that helps, I'll do it. I'm an ally, or at least I want to be. I get this question a lot. I think we get this question a lot from white folks, like, what can white folks do? But the answer is not to simply stop calling yourself white. You could call yourself Wop Bop Baloo Bop. It don't matter. It's like, what are the systems in which you're adhered and that you sort of reproduce by virtue of being located in a particular way, right? At the same time, we don't want to make ontological or transhistorical arguments like, there's nothing that white folks can do, because that's ultimately self-defeating. Like, white people have, one might argue, the most important role to play, because this is a sort of a white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal system. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I'll just start by laying it out there. But what do what are the whites to do, Layla?
So I have a couple thoughts about this. The first is actually a challenge to the way the question is framed, because, I actually have come to take issue with allyship as a way of framing our relations to one another, because usually when you call yourself an ally, it means that you are somehow outside of the struggle. Right. And that the way to actually really think about what the answers to the problems are is to understand how you are also hurt or harmed by these structures or systems, right? And so you can understand the ways you benefit from them, but you can also understand the ways that you're hurt or harmed by them. And so when you're thinking about what work you have to do, if you think about yourself as an ally, you're already positioning yourself in a strangely distanced location from what's actually going on. The second thing I'll say is that this is one thing that I think it was in what was it? I think it's actually in the Black Power speech in Kwame Ture, or so at the time, Stokely Carmichael's Black Power speech at Berkeley, when he basically says that, the thing that white people have to do is get your people, is collect your people. Like it's because I think one of the issues that happens a lot is that when white people become radicalized, when they become aware of what their position is, the first thing they do is go to Black spaces. But as a white person to go to a Black space, one, you've made a decision that's the easy decision, right? Because you are moving into an echo chamber. You're moving into a place where you already assume that people know what the issues are. Whereas as a white person, you probably are related to or have some kind of relationship to other white people who have way more access to power than the number of the Black people that do. So that answers to the one thing that, like he said in that speech, is that civil rights was never about us. Civil rights was about white people telling white people that Black people deserve to be treated like human beings. We didn't need to be convinced of our status as human beings. Y'all did. And so the work that you have to do is convince your people that this is work that has to be done, right? And so that I think, and that's not to say to not be in community with Black folks, whatever, but I think there is a necessity to understand why it's important for Black folks to have Black organizing spaces, to do that work amongst ourselves, as opposed to always having to have these places be, what's the word? Integrated. Thank you. I don't know why that was escaping my mind. So I mean, there's work to do with that. And I will say this. So I think in the Stokely Speaks in chapter 3, I think is about the myth of coalitions. And one of the things that Kwame says about coalitions, that you cannot enter into a coalition with someone that who doesn't share your own goals, but two, that you're not on an equal footing with in terms of power. When you enter into a coalition with somebody who has more power than you, whatever their goal is will outweigh your goal. And so that is why, as Black folks, we have to have our own places. And that is why, as white folks, you got to collect your people.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing too is that sometimes what can happen with white folks in racialized spaces is that part of what you perceive to be like your radical politics is being dragged by these groups and being able to endure, being insulted or being, being
this ain't the Catholic Church, we don't need self-flagellation.
Exactly. No, exactly. Right. And so I think that what you have to endure is being called out and subjected to probably the violence of your own people, because that's probably the more dangerous spaces. Because if we learn anything from the Rittenhouse trial, which we have, we discussed and Shoot the Shit, is that when you are a nigger lover, right? When you do think that, Black people, when you fight for Black people, like that makes you a target as well. And so you have to endure that. And so when you seek refuge in the racialized organizations, the Black organizations, that's not really doing the work that needs to be done. And that's basically putting that work back on Black people, the very people for whom, like, racism is not our problem. It is the conditions to which we're subjected, right? And then we can get into this whole argument about whether white people are racist or Black people are racist. That's not the point. The point is that the work is hard, and perhaps it doesn't seem hard if you go and sort of try to insert yourself or take over spaces that already have a particular type of consciousness. It's much more hard to be sitting at your, Thanksgiving dinner with Uncle Randy in his Confederate flag vest and being like, that shit ain't cool, because it can cause this rupture and family structures, profound alienation, etc. But like, that's the work, not only that interpersonal, interfamiliar work, but also within your communities and joining your own organizations, building your own organizations. It's not just about conveying how woke you are or how much you know or how willing you are to confront, or cut off the racists in your family or in your immediate circle, but also like, y'all need to join organizations too, and not just our organizations, right? Even though, there's something to be said about interracial spaces for sure. But, you know, it's that collective work. It's building political education and building consciousness among people like you know? And so I think, you know, that's what it is. I think that's the work.
Yep.
And it might be thankless and it might even be dangerous, but you know, welcome. That is like, welcome to our world.
Yeah. So this one comes from YouTube. The question is, why does Dr. CBS identify as a Rodneyist? Explaining what that means in terms of ideology and praxis would be great. So what do you have to say to this, CBS?
Sure. And I think that you probably there's a response for you, like alongside being identifying as like a revolutionary Pan-Africanist feminist, right? And it's very simple. Rodneyist simply means that I'm some variation of a Marxist, a communist, but my locus of enunciation is the Negro question and the Black world and Pan-Africanism. I start there. And so I'd say that I'm a Rodneyist because I think that Rodney, in terms of his orientation and methodology and sort of the outcomes of his praxis are aligned with my own. And so he always cared about Guyana because that's where he's from, but he always cared about the African condition. And he always cared about the connection between Africa, the Caribbean, the United States, and, you know, and wherever Black people are located. He also combined like historical study, activism, organizing, building institutions, other sorts of education to like envision, but also struggle for a better world. And at the center, and even as he focused on Black people, he was deeply attuned to, for example, Black Indian relations, because he's from Guyana, he's from a racially bifurcated society, but that's not bifurcated between Black and white, but rather Black and Indian, and understanding what are the contradictions and when are the sort of social relations where you are, and how do those articulate to those sort of beyond the space. And so, for example, speaking of Kwame Ture, he sort of had to have a critique of Kwame Ture's understanding of Black power when he went to Guyana that sort of misconstrued what the relations were in Guyana, right? That that it's not about, in the space of Guyana, there has to be African and Indian coalition building. It's not just about a particular type of empowerment of Africans, because that's the very nature of the conflict there. And so I think that, you know, that's what I mean as a Rodneyist, is that, you know, thinking about scientific socialism and Marxism as a science of history and a methodology, but understanding that my locus of enunciation is not Europe or Britain or any of those things.
I think also to that point, so there's two things. So one, responding to the Rodney's critique of Kwame Ture, what that brings me back to our conversation last week when we talked about what it means to shift in public, right? What you think. And so even you said last week, like, I wouldn't use the term anti-racist anymore because of you know, the baggage that it has. Kwame Ture spoke very clearly about his own kind of shift in understanding of what Black power, and still a fight for power, but even as he moved beyond sort of thinking about himself in relationship to the United States, to the sort of broader Pan-African context, which is why he was very explicit about what that shift meant for him to thinking about himself as a Pan-Africanist, right? That meant, but it started very early for him, even in relationship to the Palestinian question, to the American Indian question. And again, context is important. And so I think, even to that question about why do you identify as a Rodneyist, which as a Pan-Africanist, as a member of the AAPR-PGC, we say that our ideology is incrumis terreus. I think what's important about that is actually, even back to our first, the Dr. Zinn question, is that if we are saying that it is important to read and engage Black African thinkers, then it's also equally important for us to put them in the same position that we do these other thinkers, right? And so if we say that the observations and the writings of Marx are important enough, and I'm not refuting that, are important enough to be able to deem a school of thought Marxist, we also have to be attentive to what it was that somebody like a Rodney or somebody like a Nkrumah or Ture saw value in Marx, but then also where they differentiated with him as well, because a part of what the dispute is over a couple of things, at least I know for Nkrumah Ray, which is about one, Nkrumah and Ray never gave up their relationship to religion. And they understood that, you know, they didn't necessarily accept the position lock, stock, and barrel that religion was the opiate of the masses. And partially because of the history of religion in relationship to African peoples. And so because of the way they understood culture, they did not necessarily take the same antagonistic position, like flatly antagonistic position towards religion that Marx did. So that's one of the examples. And so a part of what the different kinds of work that they were doing was attempting to take some of the things that Marx observed in relationship to the location in which he observed and apply it to the locations where they were trying to actually do work. And so I think in that regard, there is something to the specificity of naming who it is that you follow based on what, and studying them, and as you said earlier, CBS, and their entire body of work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I think it's similar to the way that Marxist thought, there is really no Marxist thought without Hegel, because that's the nature, you know, of his dialectic. Likewise, I think that, but you start with Marx nonetheless. Likewise, you know, there is really no sort of Rodneyist, even, you know, probably Nkrumah's thought without, Marx and Lenin, particularly Lenin.
Yes, Lenin.
But we can, when we name ourselves as Nkrumah Terrayist or Rodneyist or whatever, we know that is constitutive of their thought, but we're starting with their thought, how they took that thought up and built upon it. So that's what we mean.
Yep.
So if you have more questions, more things you want us to discuss, definitely submit them to the last dope intellectual on one word at gmail.com, or hit us up on our social media, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at LDI podcast. Okay, LDIers, for my rant this week, what I want to talk about is a quote that I often repeat, that the worst people are not those who have read nothing or those who have read everything, but those who have read a couple things and think they're an expert. So, I mean, the moral of that story is study. Actually read expansively. Don't just read a couple things and then get on social media or get in front of folks and start proselytizing. There's nothing more irritating than somebody, for example, who's like, we need to read Sylvia Wynter, and all they've read is the 1492 article, and they haven't even read that very closely. So that's very cloudish, because what it means is that you're reading a couple of things from a particular scholar, and then all of a sudden you're presenting yourself as an expert on that person or an acolyte of that person, and then berating others who haven't read them, when really you haven't read them, not for real. And so I think part of that quote is that we actually need to take people's ideas seriously. It does no scholar, no thinker a service when we only read a couple of things and we only read it superficially, and then we go around beating their drum. Rather, what we want to do is take their body of scholarship and really sit with it, read in groups, read together, and really get an understanding of the breadth of their scholarship and the depth of what they're saying. Because otherwise, it really is just clout chasing. It really is just you setting yourself out apart from others to say that you know some aspect of this person's thinking. And that, number one, that is not political education. There's nothing revolutionary or radical about that. And again, it's just knowing some theory parading as good politics. And that is something we definitely need to move away from, not only in our organizations, but even as teachers, as scholars, as people who ostensibly care about our community. The last thing we need to do is be going around and pushing particular thinkers or particular scholars on people when we ourselves don't even know them, just to sit there and make it seem like we're the expert or we're the specialist or we have something to say that nobody else has thought about before. So do better. Don't be a novice. Don't be a sophomoric person who's going around thinking that you're better than or putting yourself out in front of people when you've read one or two things as if you are the expert. That's whack. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. All right, y'all, and that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, so thank you for tuning in.
I'm Dr. Layla Brown, here with my girl, Dr. CBS, and as always, thanks to Two Black in the Back. And we are signing off.
Peace.